Georgia, the former Soviet republic, which has been an independent nation for more than 3 decades, is at something of a crossroads. Will it lean into newfound democratic leanings or revert to authoritarianism? With us now to explain what is going on in that country and why there's so much at stake is Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. It was defense, but thank you.
Oh, got it. Thank you for correcting that. Please tell us why Georgia is in the news and what's happening there.
Well, as you said, they're really at a crossroads. The Georgian government decided to adopt what's colloquially called the Russian law. It's a law that says that if you, as a nonprofit, get 20% or more of your income, your revenue from a foreign source, you have to register, and in essence, you will be considered a foreign agent. And it's the beginning, we know from having watched this in Russia and other places that adopted a similar law, of a clampdown on opposition, democratic, nonprofit, civil society organizations. So the Georgian government right now is pro-Russian, and they're showing their colors by essentially adopting this legislation, which puts incredible pressure on any organizations that oppose the Georgian government's turn towards Moscow.
And what would be the response to folks who say this isn't so dissimilar from prohibitions against various foreign lobbying efforts? At the very least, having to register as a foreign lobbying group is something that is obviously the case with most countries, at least here in the United States of America. And that this is an example, if the Georgian government wants to adopt this law, if there's pushback from the West, that this is the kind of Western interference that pushed and kind of precipitated the conflict in Ukraine. Is this another Ukrainian moment? And if so, should the West act differently than it did there?
Yeah, it is definitely another Ukrainian moment. The Georgian people will now have to decide. The Georgian people, like the Ukrainian people in 2014 and all the way up to today, do not want to be aligned with Russia. They want to join the European Union. They want better economic prospects. They want freedom. The way that this law differs from the American laws on the books, the American laws ask for transparency. If you're lobbying our government on behalf of a foreign government, then you have to declare that. That's a transparency law. This law is not aimed at transparency. It's aimed at identifying those organizations who are getting support from outside of the country in order, frankly, to clamp down on them. And there is a process by which they do that. But it also closes the door for Georgia, as it did to Ukraine and other countries who have tried to have similar legislation. It closes the door to European Union membership, because the European Union believes that democracies should allow nonprofit organizations to get their money from various sources as long as they declare it. And they believe that this law, this Russian-style law, is undemocratic. So for the Georgian people, it's a decision now. Do you go along with what your government has decided, that Georgia will be aligned with Russia? Or do you continue to protest in the streets and try to put pressure on the government to turn back towards the European Union?
So the U.S. has put pressure on Georgia to not do this, if I'm understanding, in form of Anthony Blinken announcing a restriction on visas for officials who are involved in implementing this law. Can you talk more about that?
That's right. The idea being, if we sanction, and I think the sanctions are coming any minute now, because the president of Georgia actually vetoed this legislation. She said that it would turn Georgia towards Russia and away from the European Union. The president's veto, however, was overridden by the majority in the Georgian parliament, which is, of course, controlled by the ruling party. And the ruling party is controlled by an oligarch controlled by Moscow. So right now we're at a point where the U.S. government has to respond. The law is on the books. So I think we'll slap sanctions on the people who are responsible for turning Georgia against the will of its people towards Moscow. And that will have an impact, because the Georgian elites, they like to travel to Europe. They send their family members to schools in Europe often. So they will not be able to get visas in the United States. And more importantly, because we always do these sanctions lockstep with our European allies, they won't be able to do so in Europe.
What are the implications for media organizations, international press that's operating in Georgia right now?
That's a good question. It's a little bit unclear what the implications are for media, but I think if you have a media outlet that is getting funding from overseas, then they will be also targeted by this legislation. And it's really, the legislation is in and of itself is not exactly the problem because it starts with the legislation. The legislation is used as a way to target specific organizations, but eventually they are criminalized. And that's what we saw happen in Russia starting in 2012 when Putin passed this law. He could identify which organizations, which opposition groups, which civil society organizations were getting money from overseas and then put so much pressure on them, fining them. The monthly fines, it starts with one fine, and then there's monthly fines that add up and essentially make it impossible to continue to exist as a nonprofit. Likely that same approach will be made towards media outlets. And I think if you're a foreign media outlet, just like in Russia, you're going to have to be much more careful. You're going to be targeted.
If this bill is unpopular with the people of Georgia, will the ruling party suffer some political consequence for having enacted it?
That's a really good question. Georgia has elections in October. Now, the organizations that are targeted are the ones that are opposition organizations. They are not maybe affiliated with political parties that would run against the current government. So the question then is, how free and fair will the elections be if this law is on the books and is being enforced in October? There is, though, still a possibility that there will be a free and fair election and that the Georgian people will be so outraged by this law that in October they go and they vote out the current government. But that's assuming that the elections are still free and fair. The McCain Institute, which, as you mentioned, I'm the executive director, we hold an annual conference every year with a local Georgian partner. That conference is funded by many foreign governments, embassies there in Tbilisi. We expect to hold our conference in September, but it will be interesting to watch what the government does, of course.
And what do you say to those who see Western involvement here, and again, reflecting on Ukraine, think that the investment in having Western funding coming into these organizations and some of the work that some of the organizations have done in the past is kind of setting the stage for sort of a color revolution? Again, I'm evoking the kind of famous moment of Victoria Nuland handing out cookies in 2014 in Ukraine. Is there any risk that the law is really trying to achieve a legitimate purpose, which is to keep out Western influence here in the country?
I don't think the law is legitimate, again, because we've seen how it was used in Russia and how it would be, and how it's been used elsewhere and how it would be used here. We know that the Georgian dream and the guy who controls the Georgian dream is basically aligned with Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. So he would not use this law in order to spread democracy and continue to encourage, free and open, transparent dialogue, democratic processes, opportunities for other partners, other parties to flourish in Georgia. In fact, in Ukraine in 2014, you mentioned the cookie, handing out cookies. That was the Maidan revolution. Basically, the people in Ukraine said, we oppose what our government's doing. And at the time, the government was similarly controlled by an individual who was very close to Moscow. And he said, you know what, I changed my mind. I know I've been telling the Ukrainian people that we might join the European Union, but we're not going to. He actually was told by Moscow, to stop any movement towards the European Union. Well, the people in Ukraine, especially the young people, had been watching and they'd seen how prosperous their neighbor Poland was, which historically was a country that was poorer than Ukraine in the Soviet times especially. And so the young people said, no, we want to turn towards the European Union. They went out and demonstrated. That's when the cookies were handed out, the Maidan on that square in Ukraine. And the demonstrations, unfortunately, were bloody because the Ukrainian government at the time, again, the one that was pro-Russian, fired at the Ukrainian people protesting. Over 100 people died. But ultimately, the government decided to make a deal and create they created kind of a coalition government, a government that would include members of the opposition who were pro-EU, and they agreed that they would hold elections, so they would call new elections. That's what happened in Ukraine. In Georgia now, we are bearing down on elections, so the people may not demonstrate in order to try to put pressure on the government. They may decide to try to put pressure on the government through the ballot box only.
Evelyn Farkas, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.